Welcome to Money Summit. I'm John Ogden, and we're here with Dan Latimore from Celent to talk about the state of financial services. So, Dan, we'd like to first start by talking about what's changed over the course of the past 10 years in terms of marketing, in terms of digital, in the financial services space.
Biggest evolution in the space has been in social, and yet there are still a lot of banks out there that don't let their bankers access Facebook or Google or Twitter or any other social sites. They are blocked on their work computers, and how they're supposed to do anything without a special exception is kind of crazy. So there's no doubt, as we've seen here in this forum over the past day, that banks have got to do a better job at that.
That's fascinating. Social has been the biggest change. Maybe let's drill down into that a little bit. What would that look like? So currently you're saying banks are kind of ignoring it, or they're just saying, hey, don't get on Facebook at work. But what would it look like if it were done well?
Well, the biggest hesitancy in all this has been regulation. And so banks are concerned about what kind of audit trail do I need? What happens if someone says something inappropriate or misleading? And now all of a sudden they are actually captured on tape or digitally. We have no defense. And so they put in very self-protective sorts of rules. But that's not going to cut it in this day and age. And they're going to have to give their employees more power. They're going to have to trust them more, train them better, and push this power down to the front lines in ways that they just haven't necessarily been all that comfortable with in the past.
What do you think is the biggest thing that banks should be doing that they're typically not doing?
Banks have, in the space of less than 10 years, completely seen a shift in the power relationship with their customers, where banks said, here's what we have, we'll see if we will deign to do business with you. And things have shifted completely. And so banks have begun to adapt that mindset. But there's this notion in the philosophy of science that science proceeds one funeral at a time, as the old ideas literally die out. Latimore's corollary is that banking progress precedes one retirement at a time. And we've still got leadership who's in this old mindset. As they retire and as you get more millennials in positions of leadership, they will realize that the power balance has shifted with their customers and start to do things differently as a result.
That's fascinating. So you're saying the change is going to happen just as time progresses?
It will. It's going to happen incrementally. There are very few hockey stick changes that involve people, because people are really slow to change. And the biggest force in personal financial behavior is just inertia. And if it's been working well enough for me and there's an old way to do it, the path of least resistance is to keep on doing it. If there's something completely new that hasn't ever existed, like mobile banking, people will adopt it, but the curve is still very slow there.
Yeah. So do you think that by implication, banks are fine, they're safe where they are, because it's just a matter of kind of waiting until they change, or is there urgency? Like, if they don't change, there is a real risk that they could face serious consequences.
So the way I think of it is, banks are in a decent position. So they're kind of jogging along. There's a threat coming up behind them, coming very fast. If banks just stay where they are, they're going to be toast. Banks have got to start moving, and they've started, and they've got to pick up steam and accelerate if they're going to stay ahead of this oncoming threat. And fintechs have prodded banks so far to make needed changes. Banks can't stop now. They've got to keep that process of change going if they're going to be relevant going forward.
What's that threat that you're saying is coming behind?
It's a combination of things. It's fintechs, it's changing consumer expectations, it's regulation, it's macroeconomic factors. I mean, near zero interest rates for 6-7 years now is a complete change to the business model. So all of these things are forcing banks to adapt, and they've done fine so far, but they can't let up. And if interest rates rose a lot, and all of a sudden net interest income was something they could rely on in a meaningful way, My biggest concern is they would just kind of say, "Oh, we're safe now and we
Yeah.
can stop," and that would not be sufficient.
What do you think the world would look like if they did stop? I mean, thinking 10 years from now, let's say that a bank just decides, oh, we're safe, we're good, we don't really need to adapt. What does that look like?
They won't be around.
Okay.
Look, we've got 12,000 plus financial institutions still in the U.S. A large number are sub 1 billion. The capital required to satisfy regulators and to make meaningful technology investments is huge. A lot of them are going to face a very difficult time and will have to merge or be acquired. But bigger banks too are going to have to change, or else they're just going to see their customers float away or just not get new customers and kind of sink into oblivion.
So we mentioned fintech companies a little bit. A lot of banks see them as enemies, or at least they're a little bit hesitant to embrace fintech companies. What's your position in terms of fintech companies and banks being partners or being enemies?
Well, I'm not sure it's necessarily either or. I've seen an interesting evolution over the last really 3 years, where at first you'd see a lot of these new fintechs trying to go B2C directly.
Right.
You see almost none of them now because banks do have brand and trust and capital as huge assets. They just can't squander them.
Right.
Fintechs now are much more B2B or B2B2C. And the combination of a fintech and a bank is better than either one alone, but it's still not perfect because their interests aren't strictly aligned. They've got different timetables, they've got different cultures, it takes time to get things done, it takes time to establish trust. So it'll be better, but banks are not necessarily great at working with others. And procurement's just one example.
Right.
And to be fair, it's a muscle they haven't had to exercise, but they better start. Because working with a fintech and spooling up a new vendor over 6 months isn't going to cut it.
Right. Because the vendor is going to...
They'll move on,
Yeah,
or
they'll
the
move
market
on.
will move on.
Got to move faster.
Yep.
Interesting. Well, anything else that you think that is important to note going forward over the next 10 years in terms of what banks need to be anticipating today as they look forward in the future?
Someone to me had a great metaphor when we were discussing what banks have to do differently. So they said banks have got to move away from being the troll under the bridge to being the Boy Scout helping folks across the street.
Okay.
Banks have got to figure out how it is that they can do well when their customer does well and align their interests together. And I think this notion of a zero-sum game where I win, you lose is a thing of the past. It's now we will win together. I as a bank will do well when you as my customer do well. Let's figure out how I can help you. You will see the value that I provide and pay me for it, and pay me for it gladly, not because I've succeeded in slipping something by you, but because you believe that I'm behind you and I deserve to be compensated so that I can keep on doing well by you.
Great. That's fantastic. Well, that's all that we had. Thanks so much for joining us.
Great. My pleasure.
It was great to talk.
Great. Likewise. Enjoyed it.